Greetings, friends. Welcome to today's devotion, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and there we wept, when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said, tear it down, down to its foundations. O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall they be who pay you back for what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock. So this is a different kind of psalm for us. It's a community psalm, or a community prayer, if you will, and it's obviously referring to the devastation of the Israelites when Jerusalem was sacked or destroyed by the Babylonians. And if you know anything about Israelite history, they were taken captive, many of them, to Babylon, where they were in exile for about 70 years or so. And so this sounds like it was happening probably near the beginning of the time when they were being in exile in Babylon and being basically tormented and mocked by their captors as they were being asked and told to sing songs, praise songs about Jerusalem, perhaps even some of the songs of ascent that we went through just recently. And the psalmist, on behalf of the community, is recounting sort of this grieving process for them in the first few verses, first 6 verses or so. And there's the cry to not forget Jerusalem, as if they ever could forget Jerusalem, and what they experienced there and what it meant to them. It was the center of everything in their life. It wasn't just the place where they gathered for worship. It was the center of their world, because that's where God was present, and that's where socially and economically and spiritually and as an identity, they were a people that were directly and immediately tied and inseparably tied to that temple and to that city. And so obviously they're deeply grieved by what they have experienced, and probably deeply bitter towards God for allowing that to happen to them, despite the fact that in some short order they will come to recognize that the reason why Jerusalem fell was because of their transgressions, because they broke the covenant, and they were no longer under God's protection, and nor was God willing to be present with them physically in the temple, in the Holy of Holies. Then the last part of it is something that is very Old Testament. We don't read these things in the New Testament about revenge and judgment and basically violence against the enemies that did this to them. In fact, that last verse is probably a little bit disturbing for you, if it is as it was for me, that smashing their children against the rocks seems obviously to be a little bit over the top in terms of violence. But you get a sense when you read that how deeply grieved and disturbed they were by what had taken place. Such was the case when Jerusalem was destroyed, but such was also the case because of the relationship they had with the temple and how centered it was for them. And I think I probably mentioned this several times, but when Jesus was standing outside of the temple after he had been in there with his disciples, and they were admiring the temple itself and saying how magnificent the structure is, and Jesus says to them, it will be torn down, and in 3 days it will be resurrected. It will come back to life. It will be rebuilt. And very impossible for them to understand what Jesus meant by that, because if you're not familiar with the grandeur and the majesty of the temple, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was a magnificent structure for first century BC, first century AD. It was unbelievable. And this part of this psalm, this goes back to the 7th century BC, but 6th century BC. But it was an unbelievable structure. So when Jesus said that, he didn't mean physically the temple would be destroyed, though it would be shortly after, 30 years or so after his death. What Jesus was doing was replacing the temple with himself. He had become the center, the focal point of worship for us, this focal point of connection with God, the focal point of the presence of God in the lives of the people that believe, the faithful followers. And so Jesus is that place where we can worship and be close to and feel the presence of God because of what Christ did anywhere and everywhere. It's not tied to a geographical location, not even to our churches. And maybe you've noticed that, or maybe you've experienced that over the last 6 or 7 months or so, as we have not been in a physical building for worship, that you've been able to do that online, either by yourself or with a few family members. If you've been able to experience that deep connection to God as well, it's because of that. It's because of what Christ did. And that was intentional because the people had become too focused on the building itself and less focused on their faith. In fact, these folks who were held captive, when the exile was over, many of them did not want to return to Jerusalem. They had forgotten that quickly. But for us, it's not that much different, that we have this connection with faith, with our religion, and how we practice it is deeply tied to the building itself. In fact, when we say we're going to church, we refer to we're going to a building where worship will be held, and instead it should be the focus of going to worship, going to a house of worship, a place where worship takes place communally and corporately and not just individually. So that part we're still missing. But the worship of God, the presence of God, and the blessing of the privilege we have to worship can never be taken away from us. And so that is an amazing thing for us. And I've said a number of times in these devotions that worship is something we can do anywhere, anytime, and in a variety of different ways. It's just remembering the grace of God, the blessings of God, and responding to that in a way that reveals sort of thankfulness and gratefulness in that, and also reflecting out into the world the grace that we receive from God in such abundance. So that's our devotion for today. Tomorrow we have a psalm. We have Psalm 138. Until then, praise God.